Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming, joining us for this seminar. I'd like to thank all of you, but I'd like to acknowledge at least at the beginning the presence of one of my board members, Jeffrey. Xie Ziwei. He's a Republic of China citizen. There are other board members who are going to join us later on. But my special thanks would like to go to Andy. He was my teacher, a good friend of mine, and he did me a great favor by giving this speech, because he did not come to Taiwan for this talk. He came to Taiwan for another talk on democracy, sponsored by Taiwan University and Asian Barometer Survey, which took place a few days ago. And just before departure, I got a wind that he was coming this way. So I asked him, I wrote him asking him if he would do us all a favor by giving a speech on this important topic. And for old time's sake, he immediately said yes. And he prepared this in his hotel. And I'm particularly grateful for Andy, for doing this. Andy requires no introduction. If he's not a China hand, 中国通, or sinologist, nobody else is. He's been teaching in Columbia since 1971, so 52 years old already.
Yeah. About to be 53 years.
Yeah, I graduated from Zhengda in 1971. So he has so many students across the Taiwan Strait, across party lines in Taiwan, and he published 15 books. And I don't want to name them; it'll take too much time. And if you access YouTube, you will see he's still quite active these days. And he, in some of the talks, he spoke completely in Mandarin. So today I heard you're going to do it in English, right? So, and we will issue a press release in Chinese after this for the benefit of the local media here. And to save time, I will not go on further. So Andy, the time is all yours. And after, whenever you feel like stopping, then we'll have Q&A.
Yeah, right? Thank you very much.
Please, over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I probably don't need this, right? Because I'm mic'd, right?
That's for the benefit of the taping.
Okay. All right. Well, Suchi says that he was my student, and I never contradict him. He didn't actually take a class from me. But I have always been very honored that he would call himself my student, so I always accept that honor. And I've followed his career over the years with great admiration, and I always learn a lot from him, as well as from my other students, because as I've been teaching for 52 years, I do have a lot of students, and it's a very deep relationship as the years go by. I'm always so happy to be here in Taipei and see get together again with them. Well, so we agreed that I would talk about deterrence. What we're trying to deter is war. We're trying to deter an attack by mainland China on Taiwan. And the question is, what's the setup, whether we are able to do so? And Sun Yangming, when I came in, he's seen the PowerPoint. He said, Nathan, you're pessimistic. Well, it's very complicated. I'm actually optimistic that we can, for some foreseeable future, deter mainland China. But the main problem that I see is with the United States behavior, the political system, and the behavior of some of our politicians. So I want to explain that. And so I'm starting from sort of a long distance back to set the context for my argument, starting with my point that China, I think, Chinese policy is motivated by a sense of vulnerability or insecurity. I think maybe for this audience, I don't have to argue this point too much, but in the United States, people don't understand that because they see China as this huge, threatening leviathan. And I have to remind them that the Chinese leaders have been trying to improve their security situation for decades. The elements of insecurity are listed here. Domestic political instability, a big middle class that's not satisfied, minorities like the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, difficulty of controlling Hong Kong, lack of control over Taiwan, which they consider part of their territory. Many domestic issues so that the regime has been cracking down to try to keep control. Their economy requires global access and they don't control the sea lanes of communication. And they're surrounded by the United States and United States allies along their lengthy coastline and even to some extent inland. And when they look around at the country that could, if it wanted to, strangle them and which has been promoting, as they believe, political instability within, the United States is their key security threat. I'd be happy to elaborate on this in Q&A if anybody has questions about it, but I think probably here you all understand it very well and I don't need to. So then how does China try to approach this problem of improving its security posture? For a long time, we believed that their answer was to integrate into the global order. And looking from the United States, all great powers like the United States are also like China think, we're harmless, we're not doing anything to anybody. If you just join with us, you're going to be fine, which actually is China's attitude right now. But we in the United States thought for a long time, China must love us, their students, our brand names are over there and everything, and we're good guys, and our civilization is a good one. And so we believed that China would solve its security problems basically by kind of surrendering. But no country does that, really. So that was a wrong idea. So we now do not consider that, nobody thinks that is Xi Jinping's strategy. But the question remains, how much security would Xi Jinping consider enough security? But the tragedy of international politics, to borrow John Mearsheimer's book title, is that there's never enough security. The history of the United States shows that as US power expanded, that power was challenged at the margins, and the US had to expand its power further in order to protect those margins. And so, but there is a lively debate still in the United States, and in my own head, because I'm not quite sure. I am leaning to the last point here. But would it be enough for China if the United States were to acknowledge China as an equal power in Asia, which would be bad for Taiwan, certainly, but and it would be bad for Japan. But would China be satisfied with a sort of G2 arrangement in Asia? I think probably not, but there have been a number of scholars, for example, in Australia, Hugh White, who in recent years has argued, let's just strike a deal with China where you split up power in Asia and then things will calm down. So that argument does exist. I don't think it's correct. Or would China be seeking to drive the United States out of Asia? Not 100%. We could still do business here. I could still visit Taiwan, maybe. I don't know. But to be the dominant power simply in Asia while the US military in particular would have a very much reduced presence in Asia, so that China would be the regional hegemon. I would associate that view with Aaron Friedberg. I don't know what he thinks today, but he did write this article some years ago suggesting that this was China's goal. But increasingly, instead, we think that China wants to be the dominant global power. It doesn't mean that it invades the United States or takes over Europe or something like that, because these other countries would still exist, but that China would control the commanding heights of the 21st century economy, artificial intelligence, new energy vehicles, bioengineering, all the things that they wrote about in their Made in China 2025 paper, which I think was a very smart paper in identifying the key upcoming most valuable technologies. If China could control those things, they would set the standard. Everybody would have to buy Chinese products or Chinese licensed products. China would become wealthier than the United States, and China would have all of the back doors that the United States now has to spy on other countries. So that's a tremendously important thing to aim for, and we seem to think now that Xi Jinping wants that level of domination in the economy, and in order to do so, he needs to have secure access to the key global resources, rare earths, for example, lithium, and so forth, as well as old-fashioned, iron and copper and timber and things like that, which requires a certain degree of military presence to protect those things when there's a risk, and which requires a certain degree of political influence, not necessarily control, over governments all around the world, and that China would like to set the rules of the global order in human rights, in telecommunications, in maritime law, and so forth. And in order to do so, it wouldn't need, this is the analysis I think kind of mainstream in the United States, which I also believe in today. I'm always struggling over these issues, and maybe I'll change my mind tomorrow, but I mean, this seems to me to be what Xi Jinping is aiming for, not an American military posture which the US built up over the course of after World War II of having 800 military bases all around the world, some very small, but some very large. I don't think that China, right now I'm thinking China wouldn't do that, but they would want a more nimble posture, which actually I think would be smarter, that would be based on naval power, that they could get anywhere where they have to get to threaten anybody or to protect any resources. Now, let me see, this should, yeah. So in the face of this posture, emerging posture on the part of China, what has the US policy been? I'm going to be bringing this whole topic back to the question of Taiwan, but I feel like I can make my position clear best by starting at the high level of China-US and what their relationship is. So of course, we used to think that engagement was our policy. That policy is definitely gone. And as you know, under Obama, the United States began to wake up, I would say, kind of slowly. The US is kind of slow to readjust its policy because our old policy was very comfortable. We were going to get along with China, everybody going to get rich. It's hard to give up that vision, but we began to give it up under Obama, who had the pivot to Asia. But as you know, the pivot to Asia was very limp. It didn't amount to much. And so then Trump came in and sort of had many different policies. One was, I love Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is a guy I can respect. We're friends. I gave him chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago. He loves me. He brought me to the Forbidden City. He showed me an opera. We're going to get along. And then it's like, hey, this guy's not treating me right. I'm going to hit him with not sanctions, but a trade war that's going to bash him. And around Trump, there was this contention among different advisors. Some advisors like Jared Kushner and Mnuchin wanted to make money in China. Let's keep that China economy open. And as you know, Peter Navarro, the trade advisor at part of the time of the Trump administration, wanted a complete, this is an amazing vision because it seems to me so impossible, total cutoff of economic relations between these two gigantic economies. And Mike Pence gave a speech at the Hudson Institute saying that China threatens our Christian values, and Pompeo and his advisor Miles Yu Mao-Tun, I guess is known to you people, felt that China represents a profound threat to all American interests around the world. So Trump's was surrounded by people with all kinds of different positions on China, so that it would be hard to articulate what his policy was, although I would say that in the course of the 4 years, his policy was ineffective. Nothing really changed. It didn't stop China from doing any of its things. So Biden has come in. Biden, of course, is a very experienced foreign policy guy, and around him he has very experienced advisors, starting with somebody I'm sure you all know, Kurt Campbell, and then going down to other really qualified strategic thinkers. So the Biden administration has a coherent policy on China which is complicated and has elements in it, but which makes, to me, sense. They call it strategic competition. So the word competition is in there to say, we're not trying to overthrow the Communist Party. We're not saying that China can't have a major role in the world. We accept China as a great power. And so the word competition is supposed to be calming to the Chinese, and to say, we don't intend to contain you or to stop your economy from growing or to hurt your security. But of course, the Chinese don't believe that, because the Chinese are strategic realists, and they believe that this is a power transition situation where the declining power cannot accept its replacement by a rising power. But anyway, the Biden policy is saying, we do accept you, but we will compete. And that competition is of strategic significance. It's a great power competition. And so the components of it that I've listed here include borrowing some elements of the Chinese economic model. We used to say the state does not interfere with the economy. It's a free economy. Innovation rules. The state keeps its hands off. We don't pick winners. But the Biden administration is not as much as China, but to some extent now picking winners and investing in certain industries that it thinks are the competitive industries that we have to control. In many cases, we're very far behind in these areas, and protecting technology that we think is key to the competition. So it's partial decoupling. There's a lot of conversation about how far will this decoupling go. And a key case study, you might say, where people talk about it a lot is Apple products. Apple products are predominantly produced in China. And I think the sort of mainstream thinking about this is that Apple cannot decouple from China because the scale of production is so huge, and all of the supplier industries are so numerous, and the quality of work in China for these products is so good. And if you try to put it in Vietnam, for example, the scale of Vietnam is not big enough. If you try to put it in India, the quality of the work is not good enough, and the quality of communication, transportation, and so forth, and that Apple is stuck in China no matter what. It's an example. Of course, I don't have the expertise for an independent opinion. I'm just reporting what I think the smart people are saying now, and it could change. So So that means that the Biden policy is partial decoupling, and we've seen that especially recently with the high-end processor chips. And of course, Taiwan is deeply involved in this issue because Honhai, for example, Foxconn, which is the Taiwan-based factory, is the intermediary, and TSMC is involved in this production chain as well. So if there were, and so, yeah, well, it's so complicated, I'll just leave it at that. And then a second part of the Biden policy is to restore the relationship with allies, which Trump had harmed a great deal. And this again relates to Taiwan because the Trump administration has been talking with Japan, South Korea. In case of a Taiwan contingency, what would those states do to support American operations? The Biden administration has been much more consistent and aggressive, strong against China on the issue of human rights, which it sees not only as an important norm that the United States wants to protect, and which China is very skillfully acting not to get rid of the concept, but to interpret human rights in the Human Rights Council in Geneva in a way that is beneficial to China and similar countries. The United States is not like under Trump, but much more actively in that diplomatic arena, and also issuing statements often against China's human rights, which they see as a strategic weak point of China, both in terms of domestic stability and in terms of soft power. And we are trying to adjust our military posture, particularly in Asia. I'll come into more detail about that, and to stay ahead of China in military technology. But our military posture around Asia is no longer a good one. It used to be a good one, is no longer a good one for deterring China from attacking Taiwan. And finally, the Biden administration wants to cooperate in climate change, pandemic, global public health, and certain other areas. The Chinese are quite resistant to that because they see this as a way in which the United States is trying to normalize and legitimate our dominant posture around China that China wants to get rid of, wants to get release from. But the Biden administration, I think, wisely says that even though we're in a strategic competition, we have to find certain areas of competition. I support that policy, but I worry about the China panic that is very popular in the United States, this belief that China threatens Western civilization, that China is evil. Now, I think many of you know here I'm a human rights activist. I'm a board member of Human Rights in China. I've been on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. So I'm not defending Xi Jinping's crackdown on dissidents, on lawyers, on Uyghurs, on Tibetans, on people in Hong Kong at all, but I do think, so I think the Xi Jinping regime is bad. If you want to ask me, is it good or bad, I say it's bad, but this sort of China panic that we can't live with China, it's a life or death struggle, they're some kind of devils and so on, I think is very dangerous. And it's popular now in the United States to be strong against China. This is making it hard for the Biden administration to sort of steer the boat, keep a clear direction, because in the Congress in particular, there's a great deal of anti-China rhetoric and legislation and hearings. The strategic clarity, those are not so much, Richard Haas, so think tank people with a serious argument. But saying that, strategic ambiguity. Of course, I want to clarify how I understand strategic ambiguity. So I understand that on the one hand, there's the one China policy, which says that the United States doesn't contradict anybody who says there's one China. It doesn't say we endorse or not. And the strategic ambiguity was the question of if and when there's a war, what would the United States do? So these are two levels of US policy. So these people are arguing that at this level, we should make it clear what we would do. I think that's a wrong idea because it's unnecessary because China knows what we will do, or they don't know, but they assess 99.9% what we're going to do, so there's no need to say anything about it. Biden himself, however, has said we're committed to protect Taiwan, but then the White House has walked it all back and said our policy hasn't changed. The Pelosi visit and the McCarthy meeting I consider as political acts in the interests of those politicians, not in the interests of Taiwan, to show to their voters, I'm really tough. Mike Pompeo, coming to Taiwan, I believe, said we should have diplomatic recognition. And then I had a bullet point here about people advocating a defense treaty with Taiwan, and I'm not sure that's correct, Suchi. You could correct me if that's not true, because I thought I remembered it. I wrote this PowerPoint real quick, and then when I went to look it up, I didn't find it. Is it true? Not true. Ignore that PowerPoint. Now, coming to the Taiwan question, what I want to argue here is that the Taiwan question is a zero-sum question for the US and for China, that China has to have Taiwan. They must have it. There's no compromise. They've got to have it. And the US has got to prevent China from getting Taiwan. It cannot compromise. Its interests are too deep. There's no solution, quote unquote. People talk about, can we solve the Taiwan problem? And my analysis is, you can't solve it. It's a zero-sum thing. Both sides have to have it. And there are some reasons for this, but the main reason I want to emphasize is this one, because I think everybody talks about the other reasons. Certainly in the United States, people talk about, we have to protect Taiwan because it's a friendly democracy and we stand human rights and we stand up for Taiwan. And that, of course, that's true. I agree with that. But yes, but we know that. We have to protect Taiwan because of TSMC and the technology, and we can't let China have. Yeah, that makes sense. If we go soft on Taiwan, the Japanese and the Koreans and the NATO allies will never trust us again. All true. China, it's our historical territory. Our national pride, the end of the century of humiliation. We have to have it, yes. If we don't control Taiwan, which is our territory, then how are we going to control Xinjiang, Tibet? Fine. We also want TSMC, and we want all the managerial skill that, of course, the Taishan in the mainland have showed the tremendous value of this managerial and technical skill to the Chinese economy. All true. But what in the United States people don't pay enough attention to, and I think here probably you're very cognizant of it, but I still want to place emphasis and sort of talk about how I see it, is Taiwan as the key link in the first island chain leading out to the Philippine Sea and the Pacific Ocean through these two straits. Now, I know everybody here, I feel a little dumb showing these maps to you because you know this picture incredibly clearly, but I need to show it to explain my own understanding of what's involved, which is that the Chinese Navy, so I said on a previous slide that the Chinese vision is to have a global Navy. And I mean, that's pretty clear. So some of the things I'm talking about are things that we know from evidence, and some of the things I'm talking about are things that I'm guessing where we don't really have evidence. But this we know, that China has built up the largest navy in the world. And you want to have that navy have access to the global oceans. But the navy is bottled up by this first island chain. And sometimes when you look at it, you think, oh, there's plenty of space here, so it's not a big deal. They can come and go. But there isn't plenty of space, because there's a lot of Philippine islands that come close to Taiwan, a lot of Japanese islands that come close to Taiwan, and these straits are very important, very busy for commercial traffic going in and out. And if China wants free access to the Philippine Sea, it has to get through these two straits. It's not going to be okay to go down here through the Philippines, or to come out through the Strait of Malacca, or to go up to one of the straits around Japan. Taiwan is the key thing. It's so valuable for the Chinese Navy. Once they get out, so I took these maps off the internet, and this is the one I found that was most useful for my purposes, but this black line is it's not something I want to talk about. It's a current, so it really has nothing to do with my argument, but that's the map that I found. Once you can get out from these straits, you're in the Philippine Sea. And once you get out of the Philippine Sea, you are, where am I here? You are in San Diego. The next day, maybe 3 days later, you're out. You got out by that time, and you're all the way out into the Pacific Ocean and into the whole world. And as evidence of China's strategic interest in that naval projection is all of the work that they've been doing diplomatically with the small Pacific islands to create political relations and build ports, and so that their navy would be able to stop there and be positioned closer, just like the US Navy is positioned in Guam, very close as far as military thinking is concerned to China, 3,000 miles. So Guam projects American power, from the American continent way, way, way close to China. And the Chinese, of course, consider that threatening. But this would be a sort of counter move by China to project power closer to the United States. And so the US, again, waking up sort of slowly, has begun to repair its diplomatic attention to these small Pacific islands, which we ignored for such a long time. So that's why I think, from a strategic point of view, so I'm not denying the normative and the economic and the historical and all the other reasons why Taiwan is important, but I'm saying that what makes it, that this is the most important thing about Taiwan is its strategic position, which means China can never be secure if it doesn't control Taiwan, and the United States really cannot be secure if China controls Taiwan. So there's a lot at stake. Okay, so now if you're Xi Jinping and you want to have Taiwan very, very badly, must have, can you be deterred? So there's a lot of pessimistic thinking now, on the one hand, that says that Xi Jinping cannot be deterred. He's going to attack by some deadline. What is that deadline? So as far as I know, Xi Jinping has never explicitly articulated a deadline for unifying Taiwan, but But he has said that the China dream of being a great modern power has to be completed by the D-Arga-E-Bainan, and so that would be 2049. Is that a deadline, and will Xi Jinping still be in power by 2049, or is the deadline some period of time during which Xi Jinping himself is in power, maybe in his fourth five-year term, because it's his historical mandate? And then, of course, Admiral Davidson, Robertson, that somethingson said, the former, I forget, former Indo-PACOM commander gave testimony in Congress that the deadline is 2027. And I don't know how he knows that. I don't have access to whatever information he has. And people are, so there's this question of a deadline is one. And then another argument is that because of the pressure, because public opinion in the mainland, as far as we know, is really very strong on unifying Taiwan. The propaganda about this has been effective, and Chinese people believe it should be done. So so is there pressure on Xi Jinping politically in the party and in public opinion that you've got to do this and you've got to do it in some period of time? And then the next bullet point is the one I already explained. And then there's an argument by Michael Beckley, who's a Columbia student, and he was my student, and Hal Brands, about the closing window, that they argue that this is the time when the balance of power between China and the United States and the balance of political resolution is most favorable to China, and they therefore predict that China will move sooner rather than later. On the other hand, though, there's another interpretation of Xi Jinping's thinking. So some of these, as I said, are things that we know, and some of them are things that I'm guessing. First bullet point, we know that a lot of Chinese strategic intellectuals have said this. What we don't really know is whether they represent Xi Jinping's thinking. But I think the way the Chinese, so I speculate that the way the Chinese system works, that probably they're saying these things because the party leaders do think that way. And then there are good reasons to think that China is a rising power and the United States is a declining power. I'm not saying that I know that this is true, but I'm saying it's a very plausible thing to believe in, because the Chinese economy has grown extremely fast. Even now, as it slows down, it purportedly, if it's true, has a 5% growth rate, which is a higher growth rate than the United States. The Chinese people are very smart. The Chinese people are very diligent. The political model that they've adopted, which many people criticize, on the other hand, some people say works pretty well. They have a lot of smart managers. The currency is protected, it's not exchangeable, not freely exchangeable, and so on. They're able to deal with their, you can make a whole long list of arguments on either side about the Chinese economy. And on the American side, arguments on both sides, but there's a plausible argument that the United States is a mature economy, cannot reach a high rate of growth, politically polarized, presidents coming and going and switching policy around, most of them having no experience, having been a governor of some state, and so forth, and that China's rising. And even though under the Biden administration right now things look pretty good, the Biden administration has effectively supported Ukraine, brought the allies together, the economy is doing pretty okay. The stock market went up yesterday, and so forth and so on. But that in the long, that's just a blip, and in the long term, Trump will win, and the U.S. will completely collapse. Oh my God. So the argument would be that Xi Jinping doesn't think there's a closing window, but instead thinks that the long-term trend is favorable to China. and that at some point in the future, the American political system will understand that, okay, we tried and we lost. China now is the big dog on the street, and at that point, Xi Jinping can take what he wants without actually having to fight a war, so he is patient. That's number one argument. Number two argument is that Xi Jinping has a lot of leverage in Taiwan in terms of Taiwan's economic dependency, in terms of pro-China media, in terms of information warfare. I can't independently assess. I just don't have enough knowledge to know how much leverage Xi Jinping has in Taiwan, but plausibly, though, he would think, I don't think he would think any longer that the Taiwan Tongbao would want to unify with China, that they would love China. I think he probably has enough information to know that public opinion in Taiwan is predominantly anti-unification from the Zhengda surveys and elsewhere. But he might think, I still can, under a condition in which American support has weakened and become less reliable, I have a lot of ways to persuade the Taiwan residents that even if you don't like us, we are your only choice. We're big, we're nearby, and you should take the best deal that you can get. Third, he must know, so here we have a big debate in the United States, and perhaps here you're having a similar debate about whether an autocrat like Xi Jinping gets true information from his advisors. Does he call in the military guys and say, I want you guys to be ready to attack Taiwan, are you ready? And they say, yeah, we're ready, it's easy. Do they tell him those lies? Because, and my assessment is, and here I don't have information about what he knows, but I'm just guessing that he knows at least as much as I know. I hope he does, you know. And I know, and you know, and any independent person knows that any military operation against Taiwan is extremely difficult and will spread out and will exact a huge cost in Taiwan and China on China's diplomacy and so on. I hope he knows that. Putin apparently didn't know that. That's what scares us, is Putin didn't understand that. But I think in the case of a Taiwan situation, it's easier to know that than, you know, Putin made a mistake, but a lot of people, the Western intelligence made the same mistake and thought, okay, Putin's going to win in a few days. So everybody didn't. But this is different. We all know that this is a difficult operation. He knows that his military is not ready because he himself has said you must get ready by 2027. But when he sees what's happening in Ukraine, presumably he's realizing that the challenge is even bigger than he thought. And my final point is, when I look at Xi Jinping's behavior in other situations, I'm pretty impressed with his style. I don't like the guy, right? But I'm impressed with his strategic style, which I call careful risk taker. But and I don't like that phrase. I need a better phrase because the emphasis is on risk taker. He never wants to just let things stay the way they are. He doesn't accept the status quo with respect to China's security weaknesses, and we see the Belt and Road Initiative, and we see the buildup of the Chinese Navy, and we see he's doing things. He's not like previous leaders who would accept a lack of progress. So the South China Sea is a great example of his strategic style, which is that he moved from, under Xi Jinping, the situation changed from one in which the United States dominated the South China Sea and flew planes and ships just out at the 12 nautical mile zone of China, spying on Chinese military operations, surveying the bottom of the South China Sea, preparing preparing the United States for a military operation if that should happen, and the Chinese could not prevent the US from doing these things, to what it is now, where the US has great difficulty in operating in the South China Sea and is constantly interfered with Chinese planes and ships. And China dominates I would say, put it simply, dominates the South China Sea. How did he do that? Partly by building up his, Navy, Coast Guard, armed fishing fleet, partly by building these sand islands, and then he went to the White House and promised Obama, I'm not going to militarize the islands, and he militarizes the island. The Philippines does lawfare, legal warfare, suing China, and China loses, China ignores it and gives counter lawfare, saying that we never accepted jurisdiction from this arbitral tribunal. And they do lawfare by designating sections of the South China Sea as subsidiary governance units of Hainan province. And and nobody can stop him. The US has no way to really stop this. The Philippines can't stop it. Malaysia, the other countries that contest these rights are unable to stop it. There's a very good book just came out by Isaac Cardon, Kardon, on China's maritime law. So maritime law governs access to not to land features, but to parts to the water around land. And he describes how the Chinese have built up a big cadre of experts in maritime law who have their interpretation of maritime law, which Isaac says contradicts the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But the Chinese have all of their own lawyers, like anybody else, as Taiwan has, and So, and I think he's changed the status quo in the Diaoyutai Islands. He's changed the status quo in with the Belt and Road in South Asia, in Pakistan, in Africa. Not so successful in Europe. He changed the status quo in Europe with much more Chinese influence, but kind of overdid. So the Europeans are pulling back. So that's why I say he's willing to try these things without giving the other side a real opportunity to stop him. He's very strategic, and there's some risk, but he's not taking crazy risks. Therefore, I think he has to have Taiwan, will insist upon taking Taiwan sometime down the road, maybe not him, maybe a successor. And at that time, we'll face a big test, but that we can deter him in the sort of foreseeable future, as long as he thinks all of these things that I'm guessing he thinks, that he can afford to wait, unless something triggers him so that he's forced to attack. So in the meantime, what he wants to do is to make sure that Taiwan doesn't engage in the so-called creeping independence. And that's why the 92 consensus is so important. Suu Kyi's 92 consensus is so important to him because it's a symbolic recognition that whoever embraces the 92 consensus is not trying to engage in creeping independence. However, I'm going to argue that embracing the 92 consensus is not enough to stabilize the situation. Well, let's see. So, but we have to understand how to deter. And so I go back to this old book by Thomas Schelling about deterrence, where he said that deterrence has two parts, credible threat and credible assurance. And we have Tom Christensen, my colleague now at Columbia, and some of these other people, Bonnie Glaser, I know is very, very well known here, and some other people wrote a paper which is directed at American politicians, trying to tell them not to forget the credible assurance part of deterrence, which we published online and also in a short version in Foreign Affairs on the website. Do we have credible threat and do we have credible assurance? I don't think right now that we have credible threat, and I guess that what I'm saying on this PowerPoint is, I think pretty much everybody knows and agrees with this. As far as I'm aware, this is no special thing on my part. But as far as Taiwan is concerned, I mean, we find that the young people want peace, but they don't want to join the military. In Korea, everybody goes back. If they're studying in the US, they'll stop their college studies and go back and serve 2 years, and there's no question about it. But the young people in Taiwan are not used to that. We don't know whether, I hear a lot of debate about whether the public in Taiwan is prepared to bear the burden of a war if it happens. The military training is said to be weak. Now, I don't know this directly, but that's what I hear from people. The weapons and stockpiles and so forth are insufficient. And on the US side, the US continues to be bogged down elsewhere. We got out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq. Now we're involved in the Ukraine war indirectly. I think the most important thing is the second bullet point there is that our old posture around Taiwan was a good one when China was weaker, and that was that we had these huge bases, Guam, Okinawa, and these huge aircraft carriers, and in those good old days, we could get close to China. We could threaten the China mainland. We could get very close to China. But in the intervening years, the Pentagon says that China has developed this suite of capabilities, missiles, submarines, space sensors, and so forth, that the Pentagon calls A2AD, anti-access area denial, which means, in a short phrase, that they could hit Guam even with missiles, and they could sink aircraft carriers, potentially. Of course, the aircraft carriers have their aircraft carrier battle group that tries to protect them, but the Pentagon says that they could get us, and the aircraft carrier carries 5,000 to 7,000 personnel, which is a lot. If they sunk an aircraft carrier, U.S. would suffer more casualties than we have suffered, for example, in Afghanistan over the course of 15 years. And the U.S. way of fighting wars is to avoid U.S. casualties, not 100%, but to minimize them and kill everybody else instead. And our politics render us our threat unclear. You're not sure whether, say, a President Trump would authorize what he would authorize in case of a Taiwan contingency. If it isn't Trump, it's some other person who doesn't understand the Taiwan issue. It's amazing how few American politicians really understand the Taiwan situation because of its complexity. Japan and South Korea would not get into the war. Would they allow U.S. assets that are positioned there to be used in the war? Probably yes, but that's what's being negotiated, so their cooperation would be limited. But as I say, regardless of that, China does expect a U.S. intervention, so it's not hopeless. What about credible assurance? I don't think that any politician in Taiwan, no matter who it is trusted by Beijing. And of course, they don't trust Lai Ching-te, whom they see as, you know, I guess for good reason, as an independence advocate. If he were elected president, and if he said, we're not going to rock the boat, it doesn't mean that China would believe it. If either of the other two guys were elected and said, we want dialogue, which as I understand it is kind of what actually all three of them want and what Tsai Ing-wen wants and everybody wants. China, I don't think that Xi Jinping is the kind of person who would settle for dialogue, because there's been dialogue before. They had dialogue under Li Denghui. They thought Li Denghui was a reasonable guy. He was Kuomintang. He was spoke about Guotong Gangling, and you know, he said, yeah, we're going to have Tongyi, but there's a Sangha Jieduan, you know, and stuff like this. And so they're like, oh, great, okay, Sangha Jieduan. Oh, wait, the Sangha Jieduan is Gongchandang Jieti, you know, okay, no. That's not going to happen. But so they're like, we got tricked by Li Denghui. Okay, but, and then, you know, of course, as soon as he's leaving office, it's Liang Guolun. So they're, oh my God, this guy tricked us. And then Ma Ying-jeou comes in, and they say, okay, we can deal with Ma Ying-jeou, and we're going to give him all of these economic agreements, and everything is going to be great, and Ma Ying-jeou is going to meet with Xi Jinping in Singapore, and so they're reasonable. And then when Ma Ying-jeou left office, and you look at what did we get? Did we get Zhengzhi Pan? Did we actually get anything? Nothing. And I think they understand that any president of Taiwan, because it's Taiwan, because of it's a democracy, because it's public opinion, really can't give them what they want. They don't just want dialogue. That would be stability. That would be status quo. That would be in the interests of the United States. Xi Jinping, going back to my example of the South China Sea, Diaoyutai Belt and Road, is not the kind of person who says, okay, we have dialogue with Taiwan, things are stabilized, Taiwan is not going to declare independence, and so I can go back to bed and have a night. No. Xi Jinping wants to move the ball, to use an American football analogy, move the ball down the field, even if it's a running game. He's not going to pass for the touchdown. But he wants progress. So whoever gets elected, I think, Xi Jinping is going to demand, and I don't know how, right? Because the Chinese are very creative. So is it going to be more military pressure? Oh, when I was talking about the South China Sea and so forth, I forgot to mention a very important example of where Xi Jinping has changed the status quo, and that is around Taiwan with the military operations that have now become every day. And that is now the status quo, is Chinese military operations all around Taiwan every day, and Taiwan aircraft scrambling every day without anybody being able to prevent him from doing so. So somehow or another, he's going to pressure the new president and say, I need significant change from you, or otherwise, whether it's military, diplomatic, economic, cyber, lawfare, or what, I can't predict, that he's going to keep ramping up the pressure. But our job is to prevent him from actually launching a military attack. I don't think it's possible. I'm not saying that any of these guys should give Xi Jinping credible assurance and say, I promise not to rock the boat, because they can't. This is a structural reality. I don't blame any of them for that. Nobody, Beijing cannot trust any Taiwanese politician. Well, what about the United States? And here's where my worry comes in. because the United States should, I think, and we argued in that paper that I showed you, stick to the old policy. Don't say anything upsetting. We can do things. We should do things. We are doing things. We're improving our military posture in the region slowly. It's inevitably a slow thing. We're working with Taiwan to improve Taiwan's resilience, stockpiling, weapons, military strategy. We should do those things without talking about it. The mainland knows what we're doing, but as long as we don't talk about it and say things that are provocative, Xi Jinping will not be backed into a corner. But can we trust these guys? And this is what we have. You know, unfortunately, Tom Christensen is not president. I'm not vice president, and Bonnie Glaser is not Secretary of State. I don't know why. Why aren't we? You know, this is Mike Gallagher. I worry that all of the anti-China hysteria in the United States and the political benefit of saying things that visiting Taiwan like Pelosi did, or meeting with her in California, and saying we must defend Taiwan or Taiwan should be independent and so forth, that those things make the situation much worse. I feel like so am I optimistic? I would be optimistic if these people would shut up. That would also make me more optimistic about the United States if they would all shut the hell up. You know, if they would mind their manners and control themselves, I would be optimistic that we could prevent a war, prevent China from launching an attack in the foreseeable future. But the pessimistic side, two pessimistic sides, one is these people actually are in control, but the other pessimistic side of it is Xi Jinping will not just rest. He will ramp up pressure. So we're all going to have a very hard time because Xi Jinping is going to keep the pressure somehow, some way. So for example, if I think that whoever gets elected, I think the Chinese will send a message to that person and say, you must recognize the 92 consensus. If they don't, which I think they won't probably, no matter which party, I don't know, I'm just guessing now really, Suu Kyi can tell us. If they don't do it, China will put more pressure. If they do it, China will regard that as the first step and put more pressure. So either way, it's more pressure from mainland. So here's my conclusions. I don't expect China to soften its position. I think the slogan of maintaining the status quo is already out of date. There's no, you know, of course we can debate what the status quo is, but I think with Xi Jinping, the status quo is yesterday and it's not today. And some people who say, is there some way to talk with the mainland and solve the Taiwan problem? I think there isn't, because I see it as a zero-sum thing. And the zero-sum is between China and the United States, with Taiwan as the thing being fought over, you know, so that Taiwan's own degree of agency is limited, unfortunately. And you know, I speak analytically. I'm not advocating anything here. Well, I guess I am. I'm advocating American politicians shut up. And so I think the future is going to be very stressful for all of us. I think we need to fix our credible threat. We're doing it. We got to keep doing it. One of the things that would be desirable is to have Because there is the risk under the circumstances I'm describing, a high risk of an accident, airplanes colliding, ships colliding, and so forth. And those incidents would be better avoided if possible, but the Chinese don't want them because they see those as legitimating and actually making easier the American operations in this area. Credible assurance from Taiwan is not attainable. US credible assurance needs to be repaired, but it's politically difficult. And so the main problem is the United States. That is my report. Now I would like to hear especially your corrections, because I am not really a Zhongguo Tong or a Taiwan Tong, I'm a Zhongguo Butong. So, but certainly questions, but also definitely corrections so that I can continue to advance. I'm not retired yet, so I still should be learning.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay.
Please have a seat.
All right.
Please. Thanks a million. Thanks a million. Well, okay, we have about 50 minutes left for Q&A and conclusion. So please raise your hand, identify yourself before you speak, and be short and precise. Yes, please.
I'm Dr. Peter White. Your talk is amazing, impressive.
Oh, thank you.
We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I have a burning question about neoconservatives, which is a neo-con.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm a senior citizen.
Me
I
too.
read vividly about George Bush Jr. and then Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice, plus Dick Cheney. They're starting out the so-called neoconservatives. Okay, now you have this Obama and the Biden and on the left side. Nowadays, okay, we understand the Victoria, who, right? On the top of the Ukraine.
Top of what?
Ukraine.
Ukraine?
Yeah. Victoria Newton, huh? Correct, right?
Who?
Under Secretary of the...
Tory...
Victoria Newton.
Newland, yeah.
Sorry about it.
Tory Newland, yeah.
Okay, on the top of Ukraine.
Yeah.
We also have this America, Steve Biden, John Bolton, okay, sitting on top of Taiwan. So we're confused. Sometimes, you correct me if I'm wrong, and we're confused. Okay.
You're confused. Okay, me too. Nanda Hutu.
5 years, and we're causing a delusion about the neoconservatives on the left, neoconservatives on the right.
Yeah.
What would you do about it? Okay, would you please elaborate?
What should you do about it? Yeah.
What should you do
Well,
about it?
it is confusing. I mean, it's true that Bolton, who's a great friend of Taiwan and very in the American political spectrum is pretty far to the right. And Victoria Nuland, who in the Biden administration and also previously in the Clinton administration, I think has a tremendous influence on Ukraine policy, is also very, very anti-communist and anti-Russia. So you might be confused because both the left and the right are anti-communist. There isn't any, there used to be, there's hardly any pro-Russia public opinion in the United States. Very, very few. For example, at Columbia, there's a professor, Jeff Sachs.
I know him on YouTube.
I don't know him personally, but Jeff Sachs and a number of other people published a statement saying that Putin's attack on Ukraine should be understood, the American expansion of NATO and the threaten Russia's objective security interests, and the Western attempt to bring Ukraine into the Western camp would bring the Western boundary right up to the boundary of Russia. So we need to understand that Russia has objective security interests. So this is the closest that, and I guess John Mearsheimer has made a sort of similar analysis, without being really pro-Russia, but just saying as a political scientist, you can see the dynamic of Russian security being threatened. I guess you could say my argument might make me pro-China because I say there's a dynamic of Chinese security being threatened, but this is just an academic analysis. I'm not really pro-China, but because of my human rights activities, I'm free to say things like that and nobody thinks I'm pro-China. And then so there's very few people in the United States policy community, I think, who have any sympathy for Putin. And they're I don't know of any. We used to have a pretty big community of so-called panda huggers in the United States who were pro-China. Not just saying that China has its objective security interests, but saying that the Chinese model works well. There's almost nobody like that. There is Daniel Bell. You guys all know Daniel Bell, who published a book called The China Model, in which he wrote at two levels. One was what's actually done in China, but the main level, because he's a political theory guy, is philosophy type thing, is what the China model could be. And he praised this China model really sort of at both levels. But he is a Canadian whose career is in China. He was at Tsinghua University, then he became a dean at Shandong University, and now he's at Hong Kong University, or Chinese University, I think at Hong Kong University. He's not really, and in the United States, most China specialists criticize him. So yeah, it's true that, so I think American opinion is against both Russia and China on the left and the right. But the Bolton policy, I didn't include Bolton in my pictures of American, but Bolton is one of these guys that I think is too, is advocating policies that would be counterproductive with respect to China. We don't want to force, as I said, force Xi Jinping to take action prematurely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. 吴先生。
My name is Peter Kurz. Like my good friend Suchi, I'm also a former student of yours. In fact, I actually did sit on your class as well. So,
which class was it?
Yeah, that was back in 83 actually. Yeah. In any case,
was that Chinese politics or Chinese? Because I used to teach Chinese politics, and then I switched over to teaching Chinese foreign policy, so I can date you by which course.
He lived in Taiwan for a long, long time.
You can date me by the color of my hair as well.
Okay.
But it was Chinese politics, I believe. In fact, my
very old. This guy is.
Thank you. In fact, my question is relevant to that same topic as well. So we all talk now more about Xi Jinping and his policies rather than Beijing or the CCP or the Chinese government. It's sort of a one-man show there. And yet, China is beginning to dip into what appears to be a deflationary trend right now. It's, prices are actually going into negative growth. Money supply is actually decelerating despite policies to stimulate it. obviously there's the property overhang and the debt overhang, which is reaching levels of close to 300%, which usually coincides with a potential financial crisis of any country that's experienced that before. So my question to you is, if the Chinese economy does begin to roll into a deflationary or contractionary condition, how strong is Xi Jinping's power position right now, and will that change the dynamics of this discussion?
That's a great question. So I was listening to news on the radio this morning, and it said that the unemployment rate among Chinese youth is above 20%, and then they interviewed some young Chinese people who expressed their anxiety about getting jobs. So here again, as with so many things, we have arguments on both sides. So the argument on one side is what you were sort of pointing to, is that the legitimacy of the regime has depended on their economic performance, more so than ideology. People don't really, Xi Jinping seems to really believe in Xi Jinping's Sixiang anyway, you know. So, but a lot of people don't, but they're very pragmatic, but the life has been good, the middle class has built up and so forth and so, but if there were really a severe economic crisis, and it's hard for me to describe what makes the economic crisis that severe, but something severe, that the regime would face some kind of uprising. And then the other argument, or a party, inter-party coup by people who say you messed it up and we need a different kind of economic management. The other side of it, which I lean to now, is that Xi Jinping has consolidated so much power both within the party and over the society that he is that it's a kind of a new kind of authoritarianism that's made itself invulnerable. I mean, I know that this is a very risky analysis because it can easily be proven false when we all leave the room and hear the news that he's been overthrown. And please forget what I said in that case. But so I was here for the Asian Barometer survey, and the report from the China survey is that, which is a public opinion survey in mainland China, where one of the questions we ask is about corruption. And the numbers, the public are reporting in this survey that corruption is very low. Does that mean it is low? I think it does, because if there is a high level of corruption, people know about it. And that's one example, but there are other reasons to believe that Xi Jinping has really squished corruption, and in the course of which he has purged, as you know, everybody who seems to be his political rival, and has scared everybody else. And so he's promoted all his own people, both in the party apparatus, in the government, and in the military, so that he seems to really, factionalism has been wiped out. I guess when you took my course, you read my article on factionalism in the Chinese Communist Party. That article is out of date. Forget that. You know, he seems to have really seized control of the party and of the coercive apparatus, and then with their high-tech control over society, where they have dossiers on everybody and they track everybody's phone and they control the internet pretty thoroughly. You know, it's never complete. And if there's a demonstration crops up, they can quickly get to it. I can't see another Tiananmen type of nationwide vast uprising, and even that didn't overthrow the party. So I'm thinking that he is secure in power, and that the party is secure in power. Yeah. So, and also I think you cited the economic challenges, and then there are these other long-term challenges: falling birth rate, water shortage, climate change. and so forth. But I think we've made a mistake for a long time of underestimating how smart they are, not just him, but his managers, the people who manage the Bank of China, the people who manage these asset firms, you know, where the real estate bankruptcy that was happening, they seem to have managed it. As I mentioned, their currency is not vulnerable to internet, you know, to George Soros type of people. So you could put a bet on their working their way out of these economic challenges that you mentioned, and it wouldn't be a stupid bet, but it would be a bet. You know, you can't be sure. That's my read on it.
Okay. Yang Mi, yeah.
Thank you, Andy. Congratulating for your excellent lecture. And I have only one very simple question. You mentioned about Xi Jinping or the Communist Party will not trust anyone of the three of the candidate right now that we have. But I would like you to evaluate what would be the difference if each one get into power and then the response from Beijing, or your evaluation about how good they are. I mean, these three.
Which one do I endorse? So, you know, I really don't want to interfere. That's the official position of the US government, and that's my personal position. I would not want to interfere. But would China see a difference among these three guys? I think they must, but here I don't feel so confident in guessing. I mean, I think, so this is not, so I think if Lai Ching-te comes in, they would see him as a sort of, definitely you're an enemy, we're going to treat you as an enemy, as they have with Tsai Ing-wen. We're not interested in doing anything to make life easier for Lai Ching-te. If either of the other two candidates comes in, I'm guessing, okay, just totally guessing, that Beijing doesn't know them that much. They know Wen-je somewhat because correct me if I'm wrong, but he had a sister city relationship with Shanghai, so they would have met him. I think that Hou You-yi, they probably have very little contact ever with him. It wasn't his job. Is that true?
Yeah, I think
And so what they would want to know about those guys is how soft how much can I scare them? How soft are they? If I really push on Hou You-yi, okay, he's a policeman, you know, tough guy, okay, but now I'm not just some local criminal. I'm Beijing. So, you know, they would probably be pushing on him through public and private and military operations and communications through whatever network they have to say to this guy, if you don't play ball, it's going to be very tough on you. And then that's a terrible thing to face. And I don't know, I have no idea how he would respond. So I guess they would try to test him. And in the case of Lai Ching-te, it would basically come out to be the same thing. Lai Ching-te, they already hate you, they're going to make life hard. Hou You-yi, they're not sure whether they can push you around, they're going to make life hard for you too. And Wen-je, I mean, similarly. So either way, they're going to push. That's my guess. What do you think? Sun Yangming I've known for many, many, many years, and he always asks me very hard questions, and it's always embarrassing.
I would add a couple of words in your presentation, only 2 words, about American mentality towards China. 2 words. Siege mentality. That's what they are.
Siege.
You're using the 2 words in your entire presentation.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Siege mentality. Yeah.
Siege mentality. That's
Uh-huh.
China.
Yeah, it's like the American politicians think that China is attacking us at home. It's as if they think that Chinese are already in San Diego attacking us, which I do think is exaggerated at the present time. But after you and I are both gone from the world, we'll see what happens. We'll be watching, you and I will be watching from heaven to see what the Chinese actually do.
Anyone else? Yeah, the lady, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation and also very inspiring thoughts. My name is Zsuzsanna Ferenci. I am Hungarian. I'm based here in Taiwan. I work on EU-Taiwan relations. So I would like to bring a little bit of Europe into the conversation, and I'd like to connect that to one point you made about the China panic being popular in the US, and you also said that this is dangerous. And this is sort of the dynamic that is very not popular, it's not so popular in Europe. And this sort of confrontational approach to China is something that Europeans do not embrace. And of course, Europe as it is and the EU as it is very diverse, so you have everything. But overall, it's the term engagement is still on our agenda in Europe. So I would like to get your view on how you see and how would you assess the European approach to China and also our increasing awareness of Taiwan and also our interest in doing more with Taiwan. And do you think that the Europeans can have an impact on Washington in moderating that anti-China hysteria, as I think you used that word as well? And just on that point, in my view, if you think about the de-risking concept, which also made it into the G7 leaders communique, and that's very much a European leadership in how we approach China. So that's pretty much what I would like to get your points on. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a new book coming out by a person named Andrew Small, S-M-A-L-L, you know him, with the German Marshall Fund. The book is called No Limits, which is quoting the Xi Jinping Putin agreement that happened before the Ukraine invasion. So Andrew Small, it's a very, very good book. I strongly recommend it to everybody, which is focused on the question that you just asked. So, and he traces in this book the change of European attitudes toward China. If you take somebody like Angela Merkel, who upheld an engagement policy for a very long time, you know, the British were very keen to work with China on finance. Merkel, the German economy had a huge interest, economic interest, in the car industry in mainland China, in the chemical industry, BASF. The Belt and Road came to Eastern Europe. Xi Jinping created the 17+1. So as you say, the Europeans really felt that China, what was the phrase previous to the systemic competitor? Before that, there was another. The EU had a sort of more friendly description of its relationship with China. I forget what it was, but then they moved to identifying China as both something and a system.
Systemic rival and a partner at the same time.
Yeah, a partner and a systemic rival, which meant that we want to do business with you, but we don't want to accept your human rights and governance model. And in Andrew Small's book, the battle is especially around Huawei, you know, which is that the Americans spent a lot of effort. The Americans decided that, so Huawei had all this equipment for the internet infrastructure that was better and cheaper than anything else. And the only other alternatives were Nokia, and what was the other one? Siemens? No. Ericsson, right. Ericsson and Nokia, which were more expensive. And so the British were going to put Huawei into their infrastructure that they were building for 5G. Am I right about that, 5G? And the Germans and the French and everybody was going to do Huawei. And the Americans decided that Huawei equipment could not be made safe. The British GHCQ, General Headquarters for Communication, did a study of Huawei equipment, and they were instructed by their superiors to make a finding that Huawei equipment could be safe. We, the Brits, were so smart. We can buy this Huawei equipment, we can look inside, we can make it safe. And the Americans said it'll never be safe, and the Chinese will be able to spy on you, and if they want to, they can turn off all of your stuff, and your planes can't fly, and your air conditioning won't work, and the banks won't work. And there was a big battle over a course of a number of years between the Americans and the Europeans, focused in on Huawei. That's the concept of de-risking. But also in engaging this larger policy of, for example, with BASF. I was in Berlin X number of years ago, I don't remember now, and I was at a dinner with a BASF executive, and he says, we're building more and more plants in China. We have these extremely, I think it was paint actually, extremely advanced, whatever that it was. And I said to him, aren't you concerned that the Chinese will, learn your technology and replace you? And the guy said, that's your phone, because I left mine in the other room. Tell him to, it's probably Pelosi or somebody, tell him to shut up. The guy said, no, our technology is too complex for the Chinese to master. And I'm like, oh God, haven't we been down this road before? That's a stupid thing to say. But now VW is being squeezed out by Chinese manufacturers that have learned all of the technology. And so Small tells a story a bit different from what you said. I mean, it's a nuance different, in which he says that eventually Scholz in Germany and the British and the French agreed that not to use Huawei equipment, and agreed, significantly converged with the United States. But I accept that the convergence is not complete, and the panic type of it that's politicized is much less. And in the 17 plus 1, one of the 17 left, and I guess Hungary, though, I think, is still very friendly to China, am I right? And doesn't see a threat to Hungarian interests, but sees a counterbalancing against pressure from the EU and so on. So Europe is somewhat divided, but the burden of Small's, the big picture of Small's argument is that the Europeans turned around to not trusting China and wanting to, as you said, de-risk, to partially decouple. And with respect to Taiwan, the Europeans, I think, see the issue, have sent some ships to the Taiwan Strait. France has done so, Britain has done so. And I think in terms of the big picture that I was painting, I think they do see this issue of the strategic location of Taiwan as something that does touch upon European interests in a secondary way, because if the Chinese Navy is out all over the world, it seems to reduce the security of Europe. Not that China wants to invade Europe, but that the Europeans feel more secure if the American Navy controls the oceans of the world than if the Chinese Navy controls the oceans of the world. So there's a shift. He may dramatize that shift beyond what you see from a Hungarian perspective or even from your own studies of the EU. But anyway, I recommend his book on this subject.
Do I see her left, on my left side? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Nathan. Excellent analysis. My name is Fred Lee. I went to U.S. for advanced study. Okay, now I am a student, promoter, and advocate and practitioner for Chinese classical wisdom. Okay. Last week marks the 60th years anniversary of President JFK's famous speech, The Strategy of Peace. Okay. In that speech, he mentioned that why we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let also safeguard the human interests. Okay. When we went to the US for study, we all admire American, all the institutions, Supreme Court, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Over the past several decades, we noticed that American, the US, has changed. Okay. Lately, if we compare what the US President, Secretary of State, or other government official, when they talk, when they make statement, when they take actions, compare those talks, statement, action with those made by President Xi Jinping or Wang Yi, we notice that actually it seems that PRC, mainland China, is more interested in human interests, global interests, than the United States. My question is, what happened? What happened? What happened to US? What happened to the US? What happened to the American, which we admire so much when we study in the United States? Okay. My question is, what happened, and is it possible? Okay, because having listened to your sagacious analysis, we believe there are still clear minds in the United States, but probably they are not the majority, right?
Right.
So my question is, can we still be optimistic? Can we still be hopeful that one day, and hopefully pretty soon in the future, that senses will come back to American? We will still find the old American which we cherish so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me break down. So that's a very interesting question with several parts to it. What happened in the United States? So there's a rise of populism in many, many countries, including in France, including the Brexit movement in Britain, including in India, I guess, with Modi and so on. There's a rise of populism. I don't know if there's any one single answer. And so I think what's wrong in the United States could be simply described as a rise of populism, also known as Donald Trump. I don't know if there's any one explanation for this political movement, but I think for the American case, a major factor is globalization and the damage done by globalization. And when we speak about globalization, we're talking about China to a significant extent. The damage that globalization did to many people in the United States who lost jobs, whose communities were devastated by the loss of manufacturing and the lack of a smart policy by our government all the way along, because our government, whether it's Republican or Democratic, is quite conservative when it comes to social policy. We didn't provide retraining, new education opportunities. investment in new industries, public welfare, and we still don't have adequate support. And so a lot of people are angry. They're very angry at China. They're angry at elites like, me, Eastern elites. They're angry at the government. And so Trump comes along, who really is a political genius in terms of channeling anger. And then there are many complicated stories about how he put justices on the Supreme Court and so on. The second problem with the United States is our Constitution, which was written on purpose, as you know, as it was described in the Federalist Papers when the Constitution was being adopted, to prevent anybody from pushing through a policy. So we have a Constitution which is designed to hamper the government. So it divides up power between the three branches. It divides up power between the center and the states. It does not have a direct election of the president. It has the Electoral College, which gives more power to the rural states, the smaller population states, and less power to the big population states on the east and west coast. So our Constitution is very favorable to a populist movement. Trump was elected with a minority of the vote. The second part of your question is whether the Xi Jinping government cares more about humanity than the American government. So he has a slogan, 人类命运共同体, which sounds very much like China cares for the whole world, and the Belt and Road Initiative is to invest and help developing countries to develop and so forth. I co-authored an article in a scholarly journal with Zhang Boshu. Zhang Boshu is a friend of mine who's a scholar from the mainland who's in the United States. We published an article in the Journal of Contemporary China analyzing the meaning of 人类命运共同体, and it really, I think if you really analyze it, it means China as the center of the world, China, a hierarchy where China governs and other countries would get the benefit from China's prosperity and so forth. That's what we argued. I could be very happy to send you a copy of this article. I don't think, so again, going back to my sort of poli-sci realism point of view, I don't think that any country, actually, US or China, is really unselfishly interested in all of humanity. Although, well, yeah, we're all selfish in politics. Politics is a tragic thing. So now third, I think I'll go to just briefly say I believe that politics is an ugly thing. That's what I study. It's like being a student of spiders or something like that. It's an ugly thing. It's about power. So, I don't think of anybody as any political actor as good. And if I happened to be in politics, power is the thing you do. I would become a bad person. That's why I'm not it. And then I think the fourth part of your question is, can we have hope? Right now, I'm very pessimistic, about both the United States and China. I mean, of course, one wants to have hope. I have children, I have grandchildren. But, so there are ways to have hope. I mean, technology may give us hope of managing climate change to some extent. But then, but in terms of, and then this kind of analysis that I gave, I don't know if you would consider it hopeful, because it's very,
Please allow me to pitch in few words. We love America, okay?
What? You love America, yeah.
But we feel so sorry about today's America.
Me too. Yeah.
You have homeless people, you have 10 people, you have the drug addict, you have the gun violence, and so many criminals.
Yeah.
And we would appreciate take care of your own problem first, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, we need to take another question. We have several questions I promised one here, and two there. Okay. Please make it short and make your answers short too.
Oh, no, that's too much.
Otherwise, we can't cover.
How can my former students say that?
Questions, yeah, please. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, maybe you want to ask a few together? But then I need to take notes.
Thank you. My name is Raymond Wang from MOFA. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Suchi for hosting this speech occasion, and certainly thank you for your very insightful presentation. I think for more than 70 years, China and the United States have managed to avoid the armed conflict over Taiwan. Mm-hmm. But since the Trump administration's tough stance toward China, a consensus is forming in U.S. policy circles that this peace may not last much longer. Uh-huh. And many analysts and policymakers argue that the United States must do whatever it takes to prepare for war with China. Certainly, Professor Nathan, you're not one of them. But against
I do think we have to prepare for war to deter.
Well, against this backdrop, I would assume that the more the United States narrows its military fixes, the greater the risk to its own interests, as well as to those of its allies, and certainly Taiwan itself. So I think the sole metric on which U.S. policy should be judged is whether it helps preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And once the situation is viewed this way, the realistic aim becomes clear, namely to convince leaders on both sides of the Taiwan Strait that time is on their side, thereby forestalling conflict. Mm-hmm. Everything the United States does should be geared toward this goal. Mm-hmm. So my question, therefore, is besides the conventional wisdom to request both Beijing and Taipei to refrain from unilaterally changing the status quo, what would be the United States' nuanced understanding of Beijing's current calculus, one while that moves beyond the simplistic speculation that Beijing is accelerating plans to invade Taiwan? And thank you very much.
Before you answer, I'm going to change the rules. Time is so short. Please raise your question now, and then you can. I
don't have a pen, so you have to keep track. Keep track of what the questions are. Yeah, just so then in case I forget, which I will.
Please. Thank you. My question.
Oh, I need paper.
Please, go ahead.
The question is, actually, China is not so powerful. Xi Jinping is not so powerful as many scholars and many media exaggerated. Because 2 days ago, I had dinner with one of my very good friends from China. He shared his inner information. Xi actually very weak, surrounded by very inefficient people. And also he's facing many domestic problems. Uh-huh. So my question is, the most possible approach Xi will take to subdue Taiwan is naval blockade. If that happens, what will be the USA, Japan, and Korea reaction from your perspective? Thank you.
Yes. 麦克风给他，麦克风，这两位呀，第三、第四呀。
Hello, Professor. My name is Lucas, and I'm an undergrad student from National Tennessee University, and I major in diplomacy. In the presentation, you talked about a lot about deterrence and with hard power and military. with weapons and other stuff. You also talk about that Beijing might not be interested in having a dialogue with our leaders. So my question is diplomatic approach still work with Taiwan and China? If it works, how should it be? And can you give some advice for students who study diplomacy in Taiwan? For example, what kind of attitude should we have when we deal with China? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Nathan. My name is Jason. I'm a former legislator. My question to you is, you mentioned about the deterrence and the assurance, and as well as the threat. So I feel the best solution for Taiwan is to buy more time. But the time is not really on the Taiwan side. The time is actually on Xi Jinping's side. And I feel the best way to have a peaceful cross-strait relations is U.S. and China have a good relationship. So my question to you is, do you see U.S. and China lower the temperature or to manage the competition in the days to come? And knowing that both, I think, President Biden and President Xi wants to find a common ground to work together. So if it's possible in the near future. Thank you.
Okay. So your question was whether there's a nuanced understanding of Beijing in Washington, right?
A nuanced understanding of the United States of Beijing's calculus.
Yeah, in the United States. So I think that the United States mainstream assessment of Beijing's calculus is the one that I described, where we now think that Beijing's calculus is to achieve global dominance as the number one, not to eliminate everybody else, but to be clearly the sort of, as the US has been for a while, the dominant power. And that's a very pessimistic assessment, because it's something that the United States cannot willingly allow to happen. And so this is the tragedy of great power politics, as John Mearsheimer described it, because the two sides' goals are not compatible, which also answers the fourth question. I am not optimistic. I mean, I can imagine a world in which the US and China trust each other, cooperate in the interests, as one gentleman here said, of the interests of all of humanity around things like climate change and so on. I mean, I also have a lot of very good Chinese friends, and I get along with them great, you know. I mean, and I think that sort of on a people-to-people basis, actually, the US-China relationship for quite a long time has really been a very good one. And so we can imagine a world in which the two countries get along together and there's no big issue and so on, but that is not actually the world that we have. I emphasized in my talk the kind of question of whose navy dominates the world's oceans, but you know, it's everything else as well. Who dominates the norms, who dominates the internet, and so on and so forth. And so as a political scientist, I am pessimistic about that. And I think the experts in American policy, like Kurt Campbell, I think do have a nuanced understanding of China, but our political system is so complicated that they can't control what other political entrepreneurs do. What would US reaction be to a blockade is, I think, that the US, if it was really a serious blockade, so when Pelosi came, the Chinese gave us a demonstration of their ability to impose a blockade, but the trouble is, if they really keep it up and really make it a blockade to prevent ships and planes from coming in, I expect the US would intervene in some way. And then it becomes a question of escalation. So if the US intervenes, for example, by a Berlin airlift type of thing, or by escorting some ships through the blockade with naval vessels, the question is who shoots whom first, you know, because that party is escalating. And once you start escalating, there's the whole question of escalation control. But I think the U.S. would react by breaking the blockade, and I think has the capability to do so. And then so this line of thinking is a reason why perhaps a blockade is not the best policy for China, and where perhaps their best strategy is a blitzkrieg attack. You know, before the U.S. can act, they're already. But that's very, very risky as well, because the U.S. could can respond very quickly to hit potentially China mainland missile bases, which then that would be escalation. And do you get to nuclear escalation? So the thing is very dangerous. How can Taiwanese diplomacy work with China, right, you said? I really don't know. I mean, I think Taiwanese diplomacy speaks on behalf of the president, obviously. It's not an independent agency, right, MOFA, that has its own separate policy from the president. So then that kind of goes back to what I said about what I think would be Beijing's approach to any Taiwanese president, which is to put pressure. If that president yields to that pressure and says, yes, I understand our fate lies with China, then the MOFA or the Lu Weihui or the what is the agent? The Hai Jihui, really, probably more so the Hai Jihui, will be charged with carrying out that dialogue about what exactly would be, So I don't have too much optimism that diplomacy would resolve these structural issues that I'm describing. Here, I've answered all 4 of the questions with brevity, as you commanded.
Thank you, Andy. Just on time. Well, we got more questions coming up. Are you ready to accommodate? I mean, we have
Sure.
full.
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
You can handle?
Yeah,
Okay, I can see two hands, 1 and 2. And no more, please, no more, because he has a full schedule. We'll give him a thank you lunch. After that, he has a full schedule this afternoon. And
And I have to go home and mow the lawn in
He
New
started
Jersey.
teaching at the age of 28 and for teaching for 52 years, so he's now 80. He just passed his 80th
I'm
birthday.
80 years old.
Wow. I wish I'd be as healthy and active as he is now.
You will be.
So please, the last, second last question, yes.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for giving a very clear picture of the reality, albeit ugly and hard to swallow for most people. But we have to know what the reality is like. My name is Ben Jai. I'm an advisor to one of the 3 presidential candidates.
Which one?
But I'm not going to ask for your endorsement.
I endorse you.
Oh, thank you. And then I run for Congress. Okay. Now, as you said earlier, and most of us realize that the politics these days are dominated by popularism, right? So it's still there on the screen, not attainable due to electoral realities. And you say it's a zero-sum game between the U.S. and China. However, for Taiwan, we always lose. So how do you propose, and you said there's no solutions right away, but how do you propose the people of Taiwan work together to find better solutions? We know there's no one clear solution from God that will solve all the problems, but how should we, all people of Taiwan, work together to find better solutions? So that's the brief question. Thank you.
Okay, last question. Yeah, last question.
What's the will to fight? American people should the conflict happen between China and the United States.
Say it again. Say
The
again.
U.S. will to fight. Do the U.S. people have a will to fight?
What's the will to fight of American people?
Right.
Should conflict happen between Communist China and the United States?
Yeah. I guess, you know, it's not so much a question of the will to fight. I think that the American, it depends on who the US president is. If it's somebody like Biden, who understands the complexity of the Taiwan issue and what's at stake, he would fight, and the American people would, he would explain how important it is, and he would demonize China in order to sort of he would mostly make the argument that this is a thriving democracy and the Chinese communists are dictators. He wouldn't go into all the stuff that I went into in my talk, but he would say we have to defend this ally, and it's part of the Democratic Front and all that. And then the military would obey. Our military does obey, and it would fight. And so I don't think it's really quite, I think he could sell it to the American people. But this is where the aircraft carriers worry me, because if Biden sends in an aircraft carrier and China sinks it, and you have 5,000 to 7,000 American troops killed in one day, that's going to be a political crisis in the United States. And then the questions are coming up. Why are we doing this? Why are we everywhere? Why are we always at war? Because those questions are there now. Why do we have these so-called forever wars and so on? So, I mean, it could become an Achilles heel, and that's why we need a better form of deployment and a better strategy that's not so vulnerable. I mean, that's one reason why. That's not the only reason. I mean, there's a straightforward military reason why you don't want to be vulnerable, but there's also a political reason. So on what can the Taiwanese people do to work together? So can you influence Beijing? I don't see that you can, unless, and I'm not at all proposing this at all, but if the Taiwanese people decided, well, you know, American policy is that we do not oppose the unification of Taiwan with the mainland if the Taiwanese people want it. That would solve the problem. If you guys want to unify with mainland China, the United States would not oppose it, even though, as I argued, it would be very bad for the United States. But I don't think the United States would actually oppose it. Maybe you think I'm naive there, but I don't think we would or would be able to. But I don't think that's going to happen. So then if you want to say as somebody said here, to both Washington and Beijing, please stop fighting over us. Why don't you guys live together in peace? I'm pessimistic about that too. So I don't have a good answer to your question, I'm afraid.
Oh.
Not a good answer, but accurate.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Well, I have time is up. I have to close up the whole thing, and I really enjoyed this session. We get really good questions here for today. Would you say?
Yes.
Yeah, and we also get very good answers too. And Andy has always been all these years been following his writings and his book reviews. He's always been balanced and rational and cool, calm, and collected.
Thank you.
Today is one of his best performance.
Thank
really,
you.
I enjoy very much, Andy.
Thank you.
As a token of appreciation, this is I'm going to give him a gift. On behalf, this is Confucius. It says 万世师表, a teacher of all times. So I see some familiar faces. Those who have been taught by him, please stand up. Please stand up. I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here.
Oh,
Okay.
wow. Okay.
Quite a few. 还有讲记录呢？讲记录。 Okay, yeah, oh yeah, great,
Yeah,
great.
yeah, there he is.
Okay, I consider myself also your student
I know, I'm
because
glad you do.
even though I didn't take a course from him while studying at Columbia, because my concentration at the time was Soviet study. So I spent a lot of time in Russian language, Russian literature, minorities and economy and all that. And I took foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy, but not Chinese domestic politics. But I did try to read up on his bibliography during the summertime.
I see.
So I've been following him, so I consider Andy
I accept Suchi as
my
student.
good teacher, true blue, teacher. And this is Wan Shi Si Biao, and I showed it to him. He said, "Wow, it looks like him." All he needs is to put on some hair and wear long beard. 哦，等一下，等一下。前面一点，再前面一点。哦，是 OK， 再前面一点。哦，在前面，OK。 This should look nice in his office. I hope it's not too heavy for you.
Maybe you better ship it to me.
But it carries all the love and respect of your students.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Great.
Not too heavy, huh?
My students can sit down now. Oh.
Tea and pineapple pastry.
He's my
so that they enjoy it right away.
He's my classmate.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thank you. 谢谢大家。
Put it to the box.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Actually, you mentioned one that is very important. You said that only 90 consensus is not enough to stabilize the region. What else?
It can't, no, 92 consensus won't stabilize. It would just be a sign to Beijing that that person can be pushed. So then they'll push him. If Hou Yu-ih says he embraces the 92 consensus, Xi Jinping will understand, this guy is weak, I can push.
Excuse me, can I take this out for you?
Yeah.